Housing has never been just about bricks and mortar. It's about the kind of society we choose to build. As Aneurin Bevan once argued, quote, "We should try to introduce in our modern towns and villages housing where the doctor, the grocer, the butcher, and the farm labourer all live in the same street, in the living tapestry of a mixed community," end quote. It was a vision of housing not just as shelter, but as a foundation for equality, a system designed to bring people together, not divide them. And Bevan was clear about how that vision should be judged. Quote, "We shall be judged for a year or two by the number of houses we build. We shall be judged in 10 years' time by the type of houses we build," end quote. Today, decades later, that question still hangs over us. Because Wales is in the midst of a housing crisis. That is the message I heard again and again while making this episode, and the evidence overwhelmingly supports it. Housing is where everything begins. It's essential. But in 2026, it's about far more than just shelter. It's about home, belonging, safety, stability. It's where you raise your children, keep your pets, eat your meals, and lay your head at the end of a long day. It's the foundation that everything else rests on, because, in the end, everything starts at home. Today's episode is about that, the housing crisis, what it is, what caused it, and what we need to get out of it. Through the voices from across the sector, this is a documentary-style deep dive into housing in Wales and why it must be central to the next election. So how did Wales reach this crisis point? And what, if anything, will it take to fix it? Welcome to Wales in Context, the podcast exploring the stories shaping modern Wales. Each episode, we take a closer look at the politics, policies, and decisions that affect people across the country, breaking down complex issues and placing them in the wider Welsh and global context. From the Senedd to communities on the ground, we speak to the people who know the issues best. I'm your host, Keisha Page, and this is Wales in Context. Before we get into the detail, the policy, the pressures, and the politics, it's important that we understand who you're about to hear from. Because this story isn't mine to tell. It's shaped by the people working on the front lines of the housing crisis, the organisations working hard to fix it, and those seeing its impact in every single day. So before we go any further, let's start with some introductions. To that end, let's meet voices from the sector who are taking part in today's episode.
Yep, so I'm Robin White. I'm the head of campaigns at Shelter Cymru. Shelter Cymru are obviously, Wales' national housing charity. We do housing advice and advocacy for people all across Wales, and we also campaign on the causes of homelessness and, of course, ending them.
Then we have Gareth from Tai Pob. Tai Pob is a Welsh organisation that works to promote equality and social justice within the housing sector, focusing on ensuring that everyone has fair access to safe and suitable homes.
Yeah, I'm Gareth. I'm the policy manager at Tai Pob. So I've actually only been here for 3 months, so I'm fairly new. But before that, I worked for the Welsh Refugee Council. I was there doing housing policy for 3 years, just over 3 years. And before that, I was at Cymorth Cymru doing research, which is another housing and homelessness charity, and I was 4 years there. So I'm fairly familiar with some of the housing challenges Wales face, and having looked at it from different perspectives. But Tai Pob is a housing equalities charity. Been going since around 2005. We recently celebrated our 20th anniversary, which is always exciting to be going there. And just looking at trying to create more equal Wales through the lens of housing.
Then, as you heard from in the introduction, we have Wendy Dearden from the Bevan Foundation, a think tank named after Nye Bevan and his social justice legacy. The organisation itself is apolitical, but seeks to embody the morals and motivations of Nye himself, not just in the legacy of the NHS, but in terms of his wider beliefs and opinions.
I'm Wendy Dearden, and I'm a Senior Policy and Research Officer, and I'm your housing head today.
Then we have Debbie from Crisis, who probably doesn't know this, but very much contributed to the idea for this episode. I met Debbie with Katie Dalton, Director of Cymorth Cymru, at 2 conferences earlier this year. I knew Katie Dalton from years ago and enjoyed catching up with her. During these conversations, I had the privilege of hearing the passion that these 2 individuals have for this topic, and the knowledge, as do all the professionals and contributors to these episodes. But it was those conversations with Debbie and Katie that really developed and sparked this episode idea for me.
So I'm Debbie Thomas, Head of Policy and Communications at Crisis in Wales. Crisis is the national charity dedicated to ending homelessness. And we do that in lots of different ways. So we support people who are facing homelessness and at risk of homelessness directly at our Skylight centres, including our Skylight Centre in South Wales, really helping them to find a stable place to call home and looking holistically at the trauma that they're facing and how we can help them to build a journey beyond homelessness. So that might include emotional support, it might include looking at finances, it might include looking at kind of employment as well. It can include a whole host of things. It's really well-rounded support that we offer to people. In addition to our direct support, as part of our mission to end homelessness, Crisis is absolutely dedicated to researching the causes of homelessness and the solutions needed to end it, and then working really closely with partners across the sector and within government and within local government to look at ways to bring those solutions forward. So some of that is through projects that we run to kind of trial different systems and try and find out new ways of working, and some of that is through lobbying for change. So, for example, lobbying for changes to the law. So Crisis does lots of different things, but really focused on ending homelessness.
Then we have Ellie Locke, who works for Community Housing Cymru.
So I'm Ellie Locke. I'm Head of Policy and Research at Community Housing Cymru. So Community Housing Cymru is the voice of housing associations in Wales. So we're the trade body for housing associations. We represent all 30 of the housing associations that there are in Wales. They own over 170,000 homes that house about 10% of the Welsh population. So quite an important sector in terms of housing for people in Wales. So I oversee lots of the policy and research work, as you might expect from the job title. So we do research on all sorts of things. We've recently put out research on the socioeconomic impact of housing associations. Obviously, all of the work we do is aimed at ensuring that the policy and research and overall environment for housing associations enables them to keep building homes and delivering services that meet tenants' needs. So that's my focus. And I've been working with the team closely on the pieces of legislation going through the Senedd most recently.
Before we get into the rest of the episode, I want to say a huge thank you to every single person who has contributed to this episode. It would be a lot less impactful without you here to assist me, and I am so grateful for that. Additionally, while the housing sector is in the midst of a crisis, the housing third sector in Wales has some of the brightest and most compassionate people in Britain. I'm convinced of it. These individuals are brilliant at what they do. Their contributions are endless, and I am really thankful for them for all they do. I also want to give a shout out to Will Hayward, whose book also contributed to this episode. I had actually intended to script this episode last Saturday, but then I was invited to Will's book launch on the Friday. That forced me to revisit this episode as he spoke so passionately about his chapter on housing. Some of that has helped with my research, but this podcast should not replace your reading of his book. At this point, I am about 50% of the way through Who Cares About Wales, and it is a truly important piece of work ahead of the election. I will pop a link for the book in the show notes. This episode aims to explore as many of those issues as possible. This episode aims to explore as many of the key topics in the housing sector that need to be discussed, from policy to lived experience, while recognising that no single episode can ever truly capture the full complexity of the crisis that is so wide-reaching. But understanding even part of that picture matters, because housing shapes not just where we live, but the opportunities that we have in life. While much of the housing debate focuses on systems, supply and policy, quite rightly as they are solvable issues, the impact of housing insecurity is ultimately felt at a human level, shaping people's health, education and life chances. In this episode, we'll be exploring the systems, how housing works in Wales, where it falls short, and what could change. But to understand why those questions matter, it's important to start with the impact that housing has on people's lives. Housing is not just about where people live. It underpins almost every aspect of daily life. A stable home can support better physical and mental health, create the conditions for children to succeed in education, and make it easier for individuals to access and sustain employment. Without that stability, the opposite is often true. For many people, housing insecurity is not a single moment of crisis. For many people, housing insecurity is not a single moment of crisis, but an ongoing experience, moving between temporary accommodation, living in overcrowded or unsuitable homes, or facing difficult trade-offs between paying rent and meeting other basic needs. These experiences can have a lasting effect, particularly for children and for those already facing barriers to support. And those impacts are not always felt equally. Certain groups, including young people, disabled people, minority ethnic communities, LGBTQ+ individuals, and single-parent households, are disproportionately affected by poor housing and homelessness. In this way, the housing system does not just reflect inequality. Very often, it actually reinforces it. Understanding housing, then, is not just about understanding policy. It's about understanding how people live and the conditions that shape their opportunities. And for those working closest to the issues, that connection is unmistakable, as Gareth from TypeHorb explains.
Housing is the foundation for everything, and I think that once you have a stable home, a lot of the other things come with it. So you know there is a very clear link between health and housing. I had plenty of stories of people who've been granted refugee status, so had the right to work for the first time, but then it was like they had to make a decision around what we're going to prioritize, trying to find employment, trying to find housing, and I think that led to very difficult decisions to make, because it's not one that I'd like to have to make myself. There's some people who already, for different reasons, find it harder to access their rights, different reasons. Obviously, a stable home allows you to, often enables better education outcomes, because I think that when we talk about housing, sometimes we think of it as something only adults face, but it's most certainly not just adults who face it. And I've heard plenty of stories of people of families who've been going in and out of temporary accommodation, being moved around different temporary accommodation settings, which has resulted in their children, really struggling at school because they've not had a stable home to go from. The worst example I heard in that was during the first term of the school year. During that period, a family was moved 3 times in different temporary accommodation settings. So that was really troubling for that child who, as it was in Cardiff, so it was, they had to re-enroll in different schools and have that consideration, or if it was, they needed to be supported to move to new school because they were only 6 years old. So it was all, quite traumatic and quite disruptive. And I think that it also has an impact on those employment outcomes, obviously, and I think that in my previous job working at the Welsh Refugee Council, and obviously that's still an area that as TypeHorb we care about, and it often falls between, that link between poverty but also different protected characteristics. And I think that if I'm allowed to just give you some statistics that I've put out,
Yeah, that's great.
that I thought out. So and this is across different groups that will find it just harder to access housing or have issues with homelessness and housing. So when it comes to, for example, LGBTQ plus people, and specifically young LGBTQ plus people, 1 in 4 of young people of all young people who experience homelessness identify as LGBTQ plus. So you can clearly see that there's a real link between sexuality and being LGBTQ when it comes to specific subtypes of homelessness, in this case youth homelessness. Another thing that you to look at is disabilities or older age. So we do have a statistics that, again, 1 in 4, so 25% of people are living in a housing that is not suited to their needs. And to link it again with health, the population of Wales is not getting any younger. And there's a study that found that between 2015 and 2035, the number of older people with physical impairments is set to increase by 50%. So this is something that is going to really increase even more in the future. So we're currently talking about a quarter of the people in Wales are living in housing that is not suited to their needs. That may become a much higher one. Overcrowding as well. That's a really big one for certain groups, such as I think minority communities. So from the last data from Welsh Government, out of all white households in Wales, only 4% of them experience overcrowding, whereas if you looked at different minority ethnic groups, it varied between 25 to 27%. Obviously, overcrowding is quite a big issue. And then if you look at just other groups, such as single parents, which mainly affects women, you end up seeing a lot of unsuitable housing for this type of for these family makeups, and you've seen that linking that with the poverty, because it's so expensive to be single parent. It means that we've sadly heard a lot of stories of parents skipping meals to afford the rent. Or to afford to pay for housing, which means that and to feed their children. But there are some people that already find it harder to access services, already find it harder to have their rights met, have it harder to, in general, are just bearing the brunt of it.
The Bevan Foundation agreed.
I mean, I've always worked in housing. I will always say that housing is the starting point of everything, but also it links into everything. And it's why it's such an interesting area, because it really is the policy area that links people and property and land use and economy. I mean, perhaps the most harrowing human cost that we talk about is the 2,500 children in temporary accommodation. We did quite a powerful piece, which is actually quite difficult to write, where we met and spoke with the likes of midwives and other health professionals and education people who were working with children who were going home to a bed and breakfast room every night, and the talk upon their development, the impact on their development, their health, their education. I mean, there are figures that directly correlate the number of moves that you do in your childhood with your GCSE results. So we talk a lot about the future generations stuff within Wales, but we have a sizable number of children, our future generations, that the housing system is failing and actually impacting on kind of their future life chances, really, if we're not careful. And we're not just talking a few weeks in temporary accommodation. I mean, we could be talking months, even years. And what we found was even some of the most supportive environments, so visiting family hostels in Cardiff, they're designed for kind of a 6-month stay, potentially, whereas they've got people there that are there for 18 months, 2 years, with families living on top of each other. So even in the best, most supportive type of accommodation that you can provide, that length of stay is going to have an impact, and that not being able to access your things and just not being able, I suppose just that freedom to be a family is probably the best way of putting it.
And that loss of something as simple as the freedom to be a family, that's what this crisis looks like at its most human. But those experiences are not isolated. They are part of a much wider picture, one that is growing and one that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Because across Wales, more and more people are experiencing homelessness, not always in the way that we might expect, but in ways that are often hidden, prolonged, and deeply entrenched. There's a tendency to misunderstand what homelessness means, with our assumption tending to be people on the streets. And yes, of course, that is part of it. The extreme end, the most visible. We will delve into street sleeping shortly later. But people I spoke to wanted to make it very clear that homelessness isn't always about what we think it is.
Yeah, the traditional one is people associate homelessness with rough sleeping. Rough sleeping is generally considered, it's obviously the most visible form of homelessness. We see it in our communities and in our town centres, so that association makes sense. But rough sleeping is also a tiny proportion of homelessness, particularly in Wales, where we've had legislation that means most rough sleepers will be eligible for, at the very least, emergency or temporary accommodation. So then, but the reality for homelessness is if you start to dig down, a lot of people call it a pyramid with, rough sleeping is the bit that's above the waterline. Below that, you've got people living in temporary accommodation, people who might be sofa surfing, people staying with friends and family. A lot more people, I think, are homeless in Wales than you would realise, and there will be people who would even not associate their own the situation they live in with being homeless, but would meet the technical definition of it. And I think that's important because, the scale of the emergency is perhaps a lot bigger than people sometimes realise. Starting to change, I think, with a lot of talk about temporary accommodation, but definitely I wouldn't expect every single person in Wales to be familiar with the detail of how many people are homeless.
That you'd like to highlight?
Yes, stigma and homelessness have gone together for a very, very, very long time. You will still come across viewpoints that are people should be blamed for being homeless, or that if you are homeless, it is because you have failed in some way. Often people associate it with addiction. The reality is almost everyone could be at risk of homelessness very easily, particularly right now when rents and mortgage prices have gone up substantially. And what we need to do is recognize that any level of homelessness is not an individual failing, it is a societal failing, because for every person who you might say this is their their unique circumstance and they are homeless, there's almost certainly someone with an identical circumstance who is not homeless. So the homeless bit is not necessarily coming directly from all of those bits. Now, do you see an overrepresentation of people who have mental health issues, for example, in homelessness? Yes, but again, it's the societal failing that we aren't finding them the right support in other places, and often it's the housing system. When people have been failed by the rest of the state, they tend to turn up in the housing system. Housing officers in particular get very passionate to think about this topic and how they often feel like they are the last line of defense for people, and others have not done their job if some people are reaching them.
What Robin describes is a much broader and more complex picture of homelessness than many people might recognise, one that extends far beyond rough sleeping and into people's everyday lives. And when you begin to look at the data, that hidden reality becomes so much more clear, as Debbie Thomas from Crisis explains.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, of course, street sleeping is the most acute form of homelessness. It's incredibly dangerous. And we do, we know that there's massive health implications that come with that. People have a dramatically reduced life expectancy when they're sleeping on the streets and deal with some horrific things. Like someone that I was speaking to who had been street sleeping basically said that he felt like scum. He felt like people looked down on him. He said he'd been attacked, he'd been peed on, he just never felt safe. And I think the thing with Wales is, we've had some changes to the legislation to try and make sure that people are at least given temporary accommodation, which is really welcome. Sometimes it's not evenly applied as we would wish. But there are reasons why there are still people who street sleep, and it is a really difficult place to be. And I would urge people, if you're concerned about someone who's street sleeping, talking to them, asking what you can do to help. Sometimes that might be a drink, sometimes it might be a warm blanket. The other thing you can do is offer to connect them to something called Street Link. So that's something that you can look up on your phone. But if you're really worried about someone, you can ask them if they're happy for you to refer them to Street Link, and then that will help to get someone out to come and talk to them and see whether there's some support that can be given. There's a lot of misconceptions surrounding homelessness, and particular around people who become homeless and how they become homeless. So what we see at Crisis is that it really does vary. People come into homelessness, are pushed into homelessness for all sorts of reasons. So, we see people who are pushed into homelessness because they've had a relationship breakdown or a bereavement. They're not able to keep up with costs of their property on their own, or they have to suddenly flee abuse and move out. There's sometimes there's health reasons, sometimes it's a eviction notice and not being able to find somewhere else that you can afford. It could be job loss. In some, there's some groups that are particularly vulnerable to homelessness. So people from the LGBTQ community who might be fleeing abuse or looking for a fresh start if they've had a particularly difficult time. People who are leaving care, who don't necessarily have those family networks and support to fall back on. So really is such a broad range of reasons and factors that can push people that, and that's just some of the factors. There's so many things that can push people into homelessness. And even across the members that come to us at Crisis, we see people who say to us, I never thought I would become homeless. Can't believe this has happened to me. So I think there can sometimes be a tendency to stereotype people who experience homelessness as people who have made bad decisions in life, but that's really not the case. What we see is that there's just so many different trigger factors that can push people into homelessness, and it's obviously not something that anyone chooses to be. It's a really difficult, traumatic thing to go through. That's one of the biggest misconceptions around homelessness.
And if homelessness can happen for so many different reasons to so many different people, then the scale of it is far greater than many of us might assume. And when you look at the data in Wales, that picture becomes clear.
Yeah, so homelessness is bad in Wales at the moment. So our research shows that in recent years, we've seen a steeper increase in homelessness in Wales than we have elsewhere in Great Britain. So although in the last year there has been an ever so slight dip in those numbers, the numbers of people experiencing homelessness are are high, really high compared to previous years. And one person experiencing this trauma is one person too many. But last year we know that local authorities alone recorded 13,300 households, not people, but households, as experiencing homelessness. And we know that in addition to that, there's a lot of people who are hidden homeless who are perhaps sofa surfing and haven't yet reached out to their council for whatever reason. So that's a lot of people, and that comes at massive human cost. I've already talked about how much being homeless can really impact people's mental well-being. It can impact every aspect of a person's life. It can make it really difficult if you've got children to find a place to study. It can make it really difficult to build relationships with your family, you haven't got anywhere to go. It can be difficult even to register for a GP, and to stay healthy when you haven't got somewhere to cook healthy food, you haven't got any decent cooking facilities. The knock-on effects of experiencing homelessness for the individual is huge. It really does affect every element of people's lives. It can have massive ramifications for their confidence. So there's a huge human cost to that, but there's also a massive cost in terms of wider public sector services as well, because people who experience homelessness, they're more likely to then experience health needs, and other needs. So the complexity of needs that people might develop as they go through a long period of homelessness is huge. And even housing people in temporary accommodation costs our local authorities a lot of money as well. So it's a massive crisis for people who are experiencing it, and also for local authorities who are describing themselves as being in firefighting mode. And we just can't go on like this, from a human perspective, but also from a services perspective. So we really do need some bold action to tackle it from both ways, to make sure that we're doing more to support people, to get the support that people need, to prevent people from falling into homelessness in the first place. Because there's almost a kind of perfect storm at the moment of, a cost of living crisis, high rents, lack of social housing, and all of that is holding people into homelessness more. So we need to do much more to prevent homelessness from happening in the first place, and to build the infrastructure so that it doesn't continue to happen. I think the good news is, in this last Senate term, we have seen some real commitment across all parties, actually, and some really good cross-party support to get in place a strategy to end homelessness, to look at how we can reform legislation to get help to people much earlier, and to bring in wider public services to that support as well. And then also to look at how we support people, making sure that our systems don't lock people out in the way that they currently do because of the law. So there's been lots of cross-party support. We've had a new bill go through the Senate for the Homelessness and Social Housing Allocations Bill, which could make a massive difference. But of course, we've got an election coming up, and that strategy has come to an end. And so, what we're doing at Crisis is really pushing um, all parties to connect with a commitment to ending homelessness in the next Senate term. And to think about a revised strategy, how we can continue to build the social homes that we so desperately need, how we can resource this new legislation, which could be world leading, but it obviously has to be implemented correctly. It has to be resourced. There has to be the right training around it. So we've got some things are dire in terms of how homelessness is looking, but we do have some good foundations in place that could really make a difference. But now there's a big call on the next, Parliament to really pick up and build on those foundations so that we can see those numbers drop, and we can prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. Like that's the golden ticket, If we can stop people from experiencing that trauma, then that would be ideal.
And while those systems and those statistics help us understand the scale of homelessness, they don't always capture what it actually feels like to experience it day to day. Because beyond the policies and the numbers, homelessness is also about how people are seen and how they are treated. And it's often in the smallest interactions that becomes visible. I told Debbie about an incident that I recently witnessed in Cardiff. A simple gesture that felt so overwhelmingly powerful. I was walking to my car one afternoon by the castle when I noticed a street sleeper in the doorway near a convenience store. But he was not alone, and two women were talking to him. One of them had crouched down beside him and was talking to him in the kindest, most humanistic way I had witnessed. She asked him a simple but powerful question. What drink can I get you? He asked for a can of Monster, smiling to himself, and in that second, she had made him feel human, seen, witnessed. But far more importantly, she had handed him back a piece of his autonomy. Debbie agrees and says that it is often about
Giving people choice of what it is that they know best, what it is that they need in that moment. So, and like you say, making people feel heard, making people feel human, because that is something that we hear a lot from our members. Is it's an incredibly lonely place to be when you think about it. You're on the street, you can see a lot of people around you, but there's a lot of loneliness in that. There's a lot of kind of, and like I say, people do often tell us that they feel looked down on or judged, and we never know the reason. People walking past don't know the reasons why people are in that situation. So, a simple conversation can really help people and boost their well being when they're in a really difficult place.
Rough sleeping is often the most visible form of homelessness, the image that comes to mind when you think of that word. But as many of the experts in this episode have made clear, that picture is only a small part of a much larger reality. Because for most people experiencing homelessness in Wales, it doesn't look like sleeping on the streets. It looks like something far less visible and often far more prolonged. Living in temporary accommodation, a single room, sometimes shared, no space to cook, no sense of permanence. And for many, it's not just a short-term solution, it becomes a way of life. Weeks turn into months, months in some cases into years. And it's here, in temporary accommodation, that the scale of the housing crisis in Wales becomes impossible to ignore.
But I think temporary accommodation gives us a better understanding of the level of homelessness. There's also hidden homelessness, like you said, sofa surfing, where people might not even go to the local authority to say that they're homeless or ask for support. So we don't always know the full extent of it. But yet that will be putting pressure onto services in housing associations for sure. And we're seeing waiting lists growing and people looking for a good home. So the housing emergency in Wales is really clear when you look at the temporary accommodation statistics in particular. And sadly, the change and the improvement in that situation has been really stubborn. So the latest statistics, nearly 11,000 people in Wales were in temporary accommodation. For a small country, that's really staggering. And the numbers have come down over recent years, but quite gradually, and there's quite stubbornly. So still too many children in temporary accommodation and still too many people ending up back in temporary accommodation having already been there. So suggesting that the routes out aren't sort of providing that stable, sustainable home that you would hope for.
Temporary accommodation is intended as a short-term solution, an emergency response for those without stable housing, providing immediate safety while longer-term options are secured. It can take a range of forms, including hostels, bed and breakfast, hotels, or self-contained flats, often with varying levels of support depending on individual needs. In practice, however, this temporary provision is increasingly anything but. What is designed to be a short-term stopgap has for many become a prolonged and uncertain living situation. People are spending months, and in some cases years, in accommodation that was never intended for long-term use. Debbie told me a powerful story about a real-life impact that this kind of uncertainty is having.
We've got around 11,000 people every month living in temporary accommodation. And I think there's a lack of awareness of what that means. It's really, really difficult way to live. You know, you've got people staying in temporary accommodation often for months on end, not really knowing when that time is going to come to an end and when they're going to be able to move beyond temporary accommodation, but really struggling in the day to day with it. So often our members who are staying in temporary accommodation, they don't have access to cooking facilities, they don't have access to laundry facilities. And that's really difficult when you're already struggling financially to have to find a way to eat out all the time and stay healthy. And in addition to that, you know, there's quite a few people who stay in emergency accommodation, which they perhaps have to vacate during the day. And that is an incredibly difficult situation to be in. Because, you know, what do you do in those daytime hours? You have to report back often at a certain time of day to make sure you can get the accommodation at night time. And that makes it really tricky to do all sorts of things. You know, when you've got that flux in your life, really difficult to then hold down a job, be able to study, to even have your friends and family around. So I was talking to one of our members a couple of weeks ago. He became homeless because of a relationship breakdown. Um, he has two young children, which he really cares about and really wants to see, but he's not allowed to have them at his temporary accommodation. So he's basically trying to find ways where he can still build that relationship with his children, continue to see them, but it's been raining every day, and he doesn't have a warm place to take them, and obviously he doesn't want to put the children in a difficult situation either. So, he's trying as hard as he can to take them to the park in the dry spells that we have, and to try and find ways to meet up with them. So I think it's just kind of, people often don't realise all of the difficulties that surround being homelessness. It can affect every aspect of your life, because um, essentially the home is the base of where we build our lives from. So without having that base, it becomes really difficult to do a lot of things. There's a lot of knock-on effects, and our members often tell us that experiencing homelessness, while people are grateful to have temporary accommodation and at least some shelter, it really does impact their mental well-being.
As Crisis highlights, many people find themselves effectively trapped in temporary accommodation, living in limbo without access to basic facilities such as cooking or laundry. In some cases, individuals are subject to curfews, asked to leave their accommodation during the day, or face ongoing uncertainty about where they will sleep from night to night. This lack of stability has a profound consequence, as one individual, Declan, described in Crisis's manifesto for the election. Quote, "It is very difficult to control your future and rebuild when you don't have control in the now. I was stuck in survival mode. My headspace was taken up with worrying about how I was going to make money, where my next meal was coming from. But once I had a stable place to call home, everything changed," end quote. The Bevan Foundation echoed these concerns.
We talk about living in limbo. So simple things like there might be a curfew on, so if perhaps mum or dad does shift work and there's a curfew on what time you need to be back in your temporary accommodation, then that's really going to impact on your ability to go and do your job. You might be placed quite a distance away from school, friends. There may not be much outdoor space, or you get placed in a community that actually you don't know where the playground is or where the leisure centre is. So we did talk in our piece, it wasn't actually about changing the numbers, but changing we always called it like the duvet of support around a family when they're in that situation, to minimise the impact as much as possible. In terms of, if you look who's getting stuck in temporary accommodation, huge number of single people, larger families, and also people in need of accessible homes. So single people, and again, it's some research that we're starting later on in the year, is the options for single people, affordable housing options for single people, are probably the worst of all the different groups, because you've got limits on how much housing benefit you can get. Outside of kind of the southeast corner, you've got very limited shared accommodation options, houses in multiple occupation, that sort of thing. And we're building as many one beds. If you look at the average a new build housing development, you go past, you see the houses with that whole thing about we've got a growing number of single person households, but actually we haven't got the housing to provide for larger families. So I'm talking families that need 4-bedroom plus. Of the 230,000 social homes we have in Wales, only about 4,000 of those are larger property. And we also know that there are particularly kind of mixed generation. And if perhaps you do decide to stay living with mum and dad, or there's carer responsibilities, or perhaps different ethnic communities might have more of a culture of living in a larger household. So those larger families, again, can be picked out into different groups. And then if you have somebody perhaps being discharged from hospital that's perhaps potentially become a wheelchair user, then they could be stuck in perhaps a disabled wheelchair access hotel room, while a property is either being developed or specifically adapted for their needs. So they face quite a sizable weight. Plus that even the room is really hard to get that's got those facilities that they.
And so too did Gareth from Tai Pob.
Local authorities, which already have, stretched resources, are having to intervene, costly interventions to prevent people from becoming homeless or to put them into expensive temporary accommodation. And, in Wales, we currently have 13,000 people in temporary accommodation, which, again, I don't know how that would fit, as in if it was a city alone. I've not done the research in that, but I imagine that with Wales having very small towns, it would still probably be in the top 25, 30, which is, again, not a statistic that we should be proud of at all. So I think that it just creates that knock-on effect, which ends up impacting everything else. And poor accommodation. Wales has one of the oldest housing stocks has the oldest housing stock in the UK, which means that a lot of them are damp and cold, which is ending up impacting health outcomes, which at the same time impact socioeconomic, and et cetera, which just means that we end up having one of the oldest and sickest populations in the UK.
And that cycle comes at a cost, not just for individuals, but for the system as a whole. The growing reliance on temporary accommodation is placing significant financial pressure on local authorities, who are often forced to fund expensive short-term solutions rather than invest that finance in long-term housing. At the same time, demand for secure, affordable homes continues to outstrip that supply. There's no single official waiting list for social housing in Wales, and that in itself makes it difficult to pin down the true scale of the demand. A BBC Freedom of Information investigation suggests that around 139,000 households are currently waiting for a social home. Other estimates are lower. For example, Cymru Cymru puts the figure closer to 90,000 households on that waiting list. That is households, not individuals. As Gareth points out,
and you have to applaud the ambition of this most recent Welsh government, that they set to build, as part of the cooperation agreement, set the target to build 20,000 new homes, new affordable homes. But we know that they're not going to meet the target by the end of the Senate term. They are hopeful that you can meet it by the end of the year of 2026, and it's great, and we definitely need those 20,000 new affordable homes, but we probably need more. And I think that that is the crux of the issue, because I think that lack of affordable homes means that there's a lot of people on the waiting list. 90,000 households on the social housing waiting list in Wales, and if you put that into perspective, all these 90,000 households is 90,000 individuals. That's 150,000 individuals. If that was a city, that would be the third biggest city in Wales after Cardiff and Swansea. And I think that that just shows the magnitude of the issue, which means that only people who are at a real risk are being prioritised to go into social housing, and it means that we have to have policies such as priority need, which we probably wouldn't want to have if we had an abundance of housing. But as a result, that means that people are being pushed into unaffordable private rented sector because they can't move into social housing, spending way over 30% of their income in on their living costs of just like paying rent, and that's not to include other factors such as increasing gas bills, electricity, etc., or they are they aren't able to afford going into housing and end up becoming homeless or becoming at risk of homelessness.
But regardless of which of those figures you use, the conclusion is much the same. Demand for social housing is far outstripping that supply, and taken together, these pressures point to a system that is not just struggling to cope, but increasingly unable to meet the scale of need. And the impact is substantial, as poor and insufficient housing affects almost every area of life, privately and publicly. Issues with housing tend to impact on almost every aspect of our lives, from finances to health, education. The impact is huge and far-reaching. It affects society on human and financial levels, meaning that prevention is often viewed as the first and foremost priority for many of the organisations I spoke to. Cymru's manifesto states, quote, "It also places a significant strain on public services, including skyrocketing temporary accommodation costs and pressures on health services. It is in everybody's interests to prevent homelessness, and the next Welsh Government has a critical role to play in making sure it is rare, brief and unrepeated." End quote. It is also important to point out that while the housing crisis affects a wide range of people, its impact is not always felt equally. Certain groups are disproportionately affected, reflecting wider social and economic inequalities.
I think it's generic, and I think you're going to find the worst housing outcomes in the lower end of the market. and that is off. And you know, if you've spoken to Bevan Foundation, they've probably already told you about local housing allowance and how there's not enough houses in Wales that meet that.
Just to interject quickly, the local housing allowance is a form of housing support in Wales that helps people renting from private landlords cover their rent. Now, this is actually a national policy and it is not devolved, so it means that the Welsh Government have very little influence over it directly. It sets a maximum amount that you can receive based on local rent markets and the size of your household, rather than the actual rent you pay. If your rent is higher than the LHA rate, you have to make up the difference yourself. In many parts of Wales, however, a growing number of private rentals exceed these rates, meaning that fewer homes are genuinely affordable for people who rely on this support. This is driven by rising rents, a shortage of available properties, and landlords increasingly leaving or avoiding the lower end of the market. So even where housing exists, much of it sits out of the reach of those who need it. Local housing allowance rates were frozen for several years from 2020 before being temporarily unfrozen under Rishi Sunak's government in April 2024, when they were updated to reflect the cheapest 30% of local rents. However, that increase only lasted a year, as from April 2025, the rates were frozen again, and the current government under Keir Starmer has continued that freeze, meaning support is no longer rising with rents. This is something we will touch on a little bit later in the episode.
So it means that those in the lower income are just going to be, they know that, certain providers of housing providers of all type are going to know that there is a demand for that type of housing because there's so many people in the system. So it's often going to be people and that low end of the market when that's what they can afford. And obviously, if you take an intersectional approach, you know that a lot of people who are going to meet that are going to be from a black minority ethnic background. You're going to know that they are from, single parents. You're going to know that they are care leavers. You're going to know that in some cases they're going to be members of the LGBTQI plus community. So there is that intersection approach. And I think, and going back to my previous work, you're definitely going to know that a lot of them are people who've just been granted refugee status by the Home Office and don't have any other alternatives. So I think it is, there is definitely a correlation between that. But I think that it's the correlation often between social conditions and economic conditions.
That is a snapshot of the issue. But how did we get here? What is driving the housing crisis in Wales? And is it the result of a single cause or something more complex? It was one of the first questions I put to Robin White from Shelter Cymru.
I think it's a really good question because it has a really simple answer and a really complicated answer. The simple answer sounds really simple. The main cause of homelessness is a lack of available, affordable, secure, suitable homes. It is as simple as that. If we had enough homes for everyone in Wales, we wouldn't have homelessness. So lack of housing, particularly a lack of social housing, is the main cause of homelessness. The complicated bit gets you into why are some people more likely to be at risk than others when it comes to homelessness. So we know certain groups are more likely to experience homelessness because they are on low incomes, single parent families, people from minority backgrounds. All of those groups overrepresent in homelessness. But fundamentally, the long-term solution is we got to build some homes people can afford to live in.
And that point, that at its core, this is a crisis of housing supply, came up again and again throughout this episode. I probably could have done an entire episode with just quotes from the specialists on that specific element. Because while the cause of homelessness can be complex, the underlying issue is strikingly consistent. There simply aren't enough homes. And crucially, there aren't enough homes that people can actually afford. A lack of housing is a persistent theme across every conversation I had. It is the number one issue, but it is also one of the few areas where there is a clear and tangible solution. Put simply, we need to build more. Specifically, there is a growing demand for more social housing. If you, like me, aren't in the housing industry, then you may not have come across that term, social housing. But it's a term that we are going to come back to time and time again in in this episode, so let's define it. Social housing is an affordable house provided by local authorities, council housing, and housing associations for people who cannot access suitable homes in the private market. These homes are typically built as part of wider residential developments, including dedicated council estates or mixed tenure sites where social housing sits alongside privately owned or rented homes. These are what we are specifically lacking. Like Robin said, there's a lack of all kinds of houses, but social housing is a huge priority for the reasons discussed. And that leads us perfectly on to why we are in this mess to begin with. And surprisingly, there is actually one clear and identifiable cause. Now, that's not to say that it can be fully blamed for the continuation of this situation, but many experts trace the beginnings of this issue to one particular policy: right to buy. Right to buy was a flagship policy introduced by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in the 1980s, giving eligible council housing tenants the legal right to purchase their homes at a discounted price. The level of discount was based on how long a tenant had been living there, with larger reductions for longer tenancies. The policy aimed to expand home ownership and reduce reliance on state. But while Margaret Thatcher's great social mobility experiment proved popular with the millions of new homeowners it created across the UK, it left the supply of local authority housing heavily depleted. When council tenants bought their homes under right to buy, local authorities received the money from those sales, but they weren't allowed to fully reinvest it into replacing the homes that they had lost. Strict borrowing caps and treasury rules meant councils could only use a portion of the funds, often having to prioritise debt repayment instead. At the same time, limits on how much councils could borrow made it difficult to build new homes, even where demand was obvious. The result was a steady loss of social housing without adequate replacement, directly contributing to the chronic lack of supply we see today. In Wales, right to buy was officially abolished in 2019, with the goal being to help protect remaining social housing stock. But the damage was already done, and many of these homes were essentially permanently lost, reducing the overall supply of social housing during the duration of right to buy. A similar scheme, right to acquire, allowed some housing association tenants to purchase their homes at a discount too. While more limited in scope, it followed the same principle, transferring homes out of social housing and into private ownership, further compacting the long-term reduction in available stock. The impact of this has been huge and lasting.
In terms of what the current situation we've got, what had been the disastrous policies around right to buy, that has a really real impact in the situation we now, and the fact that, from the 1970s to about 5 years ago, we didn't really build enough housing, enough social housing, and the statistics are there. Like, I'm not making it's very evident and very clear.
It is now estimated that over 180,000 homes were sold in Wales under rights to buy between 1981 and 2016. Interestingly, this number of homes is obviously higher than the estimated waiting list. In total, it's estimated that around 40 to 45% of council housing stock was lost, with many of those homes now in the private sector. This created a damaging cycle. Homes that were once publicly owned and rented at a lower regulated rate were sold off and later re-entered the market as private rentals, often at significantly higher rent costs. As a result, more people have been pushed into the private rented sector, increasing reliance on housing benefit, meaning more public money ultimately flows to private landlords rather than being reinvested into social housing. Crucially, those homes that were lost have still not been replaced at the scale needed. In Future Wales, the National Plan for 2040, published by the Welsh Government in 2019, it was estimated that around 7,400 new homes would be needed to be delivered each year to meet both historic and future housing demands. However, over the past 5 years, average delivery has been closer to 5,300, representing a shortfall of around 28%. But even more recent data underlines the scale of the issue. Government figures show that 2024 to 2025 was the second lowest year of housing delivery in Wales since records began in 1974. While analysis from the Home Builders Federation suggests that local authorities are delivering, on average, only around half of their local development targets. Taken together, this points to a system where supply has just not kept pace, both in replacing what has been lost and in meeting that growing demand. While much of the discussion around housing focuses on demand, who needs housing and why, there is a growing recognition that supply remains one of the most fundamental drivers of this crisis.
I suppose what we don't talk enough about is the fact that we're just not building enough homes. So we talk a lot about the demand and who's in need of homes and the people stories, and that's really important. And we're doing a lot of research in that area. But actually, a key driver of the situation, or one of the key drivers of the situation we're in at the moment, is the fact that we just don't have enough homes for the people that need them. Now, primarily, we're focusing on social homes, but you can say that across all tenures. So we built about 4,600 new homes, or completed 4,600 new homes last year. That's about half of what we were building 20 years ago. And when we know as an island that our population is growing for various reasons, the fact that we're living longer, we've got more single person households, then actually just more generally, if you look at the number of people that need a house to live in and the number of houses we have, we're not kind of keeping up with that. And that's a key driver for affordability as well. When you have a scarce resource, then that's why things start to get more expensive. So from a more general overview, I don't think we perhaps focus on who's getting and whatever. However, whenever perhaps a new housing development is being proposed, the first thing you hear is the reasons why those homes can't go there. We don't necessarily go back to actually why do we need those homes in the first place.
Because at its core, this is a problem with supply. There just aren't enough homes, so when homes become scarce, it becomes more expensive. And that pressure is felt across the entire system. And that lack of supply doesn't just exist in theory. It starts to show up in the system, in the number of people stuck in temporary accommodation, and in the number of people waiting, often for years, for a social home. Waiting lists aren't a perfect measure of demand. Anyone can join them. But they do tell us something important. They show just how many people want access to secure, affordable housing, and how far supply is falling short.
So waiting lists are high across Wales. So that's how many people are waiting. And Shelter's research suggests it's 94,000 people. 170,000 people, 94,000 households across Wales. That's 1 in 14 in Wales waiting. It's not a perfect proxy for demand because anyone can be on the list, but it demonstrates the value that people place on social housing, how much people want it, and that it could be a tenure that houses a lot more people and that has that aspirational element to it. We do know that the waiting lists are higher in urban areas. So Cardiff, Newport and Swansea have the highest waiting lists. So that does suggest that particular issue, but you do see high numbers elsewhere in Wales as well. It's certainly not just an urban issue, but ultimately more homes are needed to solve the housing crisis.
And when there aren't enough social homes available, that demand doesn't disappear, it shifts. It pushes people into other parts of the housing system, and increasingly that means the private rented sector. For many, it's no longer a choice, it is the only option left. But the private rented sector is often more expensive, less secure, and in some cases, lower quality than the social housing it's replacing. Rents are typically higher, meaning people are spending a greater proportion of their income just to keep a roof over their heads, often well above what is considered affordable. And with shorter tenancies and less stability, many renters are living with a constant sense of uncertainty about how long they'll actually be able to stay. At the same time, the quality of housing can vary significantly. In Wales, where much of the housing stock is older, issues like damp, cold and poor insulation are still commonplace, particularly in the private rented sector. And those conditions don't just affect comfort, they have real consequences for people's health, well-being and ability to live and work. So what we're seeing is a system where people who can't access social housing are being pushed into housing that is often more expensive, less stable and in some cases, less suitable. And that in turn increases the risk of people falling into further insecurity or even homelessness. Interestingly, the rapid growth of the private rental sector can also be traced back to the 1980s, to 1988 specifically, when Margaret Thatcher's government abolished rent controls, allowing landlords to set market rates and fundamentally reshape the housing system. Over time, this shift, combined with the loss of social housing, has meant more people are now reliant on the private rented sector, often at a significantly higher cost. And that doesn't just impact tenants, it has a direct economic consequence for the state, with housing benefit increasingly being used to subsidise higher private rents. In simple terms, as rents rise, so too does the amount of public money required to support them. Billions are now spent each year helping people afford homes in the private rented sector, not because housing is inherently unaffordable, but because the system has shifted away from lower cost social housing towards higher cost private rental markets. And those costs are rising fastest in Wales. According to the Office for National Statistics, private rental prices increased by 8.9% in Wales compared to 7.8% in England and 5.7% in Scotland. But even the support is no longer keeping pace with reality. Housing benefit through the local housing allowance has been repeatedly frozen or capped well below actual market rents, leaving many tenants with a shortfall they must cover themselves. In many areas, it now covers only 40% of rents, with increases in housing costs not reflected in that support available. As Will Hayward writes in his new book, Who Cares About Wales, quote, "The route to homelessness often leads straight through the private rented sector. The idea that housing benefit will underpin market rents and that if people cannot afford those rents, support will step in is best illustrated in this sector, and it doesn't hold up." End quote. The result is a widening gap between what people are expected to pay and the support available, a gap that continues to push more households into financial strain, arrears, and in some cases, homelessness. And while Welsh Labour previously criticised rent support policy under Conservative governments, they are now operating within and enforcing the same constrained system as Keir Starmer's government maintains tight controls on housing support despite rising costs. In effect, public money is now being used to sustain a system that is more expensive and often less stable than the social housing it replaced. However, it's important to note that across the housing sector in Wales, there is largely a unified call for the UK government to restore local housing allowance so that it reflects the true cost of rent. With rents high and supply constrained, many organisations argue that restoring LHA is a critical step in preventing homelessness and improving housing security. And as the system has evolved, the lines between different types of housing have become increasingly blurred.
If we look at the private rental sector, that has grown considerably as a tenure over the last 20 years. And really, it's kind of filled that gap for people that can't afford to buy and people that can't get a social home. So from an economic point of view, landlords have provided for what's needed. The data and the evidence around landlords selling is interesting, and we don't have a fine line evidence that a huge number are selling. However, there has been greater regulation of the private rented sector, and some landlords are looking at their investment. So yes, in our report, we've looked at, are there opportunities for some of those properties to be bought? And also, I talked about the former social homes bought for the right to buy. About 40% of those homes are likely to now be rented out privately. So of the 150 social homes that we've lost, about 60,000 of those are likely to be private rented sector homes now. So everything's linked. Properties move around different tenures.
Alongside rising rents and a shortage of social housing, another factor that is often raised, particularly in parts of rural and coastal Wales, is the growth of second homes and holiday lets. In some communities, a significant proportion of housing is no longer lived in year-round. Instead, properties are being used as holiday accommodation or second residences. And while that can bring economic benefits, supporting tourism and local businesses, it can also reduce the number of homes available to local people. In areas where supply is already limited, that added pressure can have a noticeable impact. Fewer homes available means more competition and in turn higher prices. For local residents, particularly those on lower than average incomes, that can make it increasingly difficult to buy or even rent within their own communities. And over time, that can begin to reshape those communities entirely. Schools face falling enrolment, services become harder to sustain, and the balance between permanent residents and short-term visitors starts to shift. But like much of the housing crisis, the role of second homes is complex. They are not the sole cause of the problem, but in certain areas, they are an added pressure within an already constrained system. My family have a caravan in West Wales, and there's one house on the road to our caravan site that is empty pretty much all year round. It's a fairly new build in the grand scheme of things, and yet I can count on one hand the amount of times I've seen someone there over the last 6 years. It's less than 2 or 3. It is really in use. It's a large house that could otherwise have people who need it in it. And that tension between economic opportunity and housing need has become an increasingly prominent part of the housing debate in Wales. The situation feels dire, and you'd be forgiven for feeling cynical, but the charities I spoke to didn't feel that way. They were optimistic, and each of them was quick to highlight and praise the progress that has already been made. While the challenges facing housing and development in Wales is significant, there has been a clear shift in how the Welsh Government is approaching the issue, most notably through the Future Wales National Plan of 2040. Sitting at the top of the planning system hierarchy, the plan sets out a long-term vision for how Wales should grow and develop. At its core, it attempts to answer 3 fundamental questions: where development should happen, what should be built, and how Wales should develop in the decades ahead. In terms of location, the plan identifies key growth areas across the country, dividing Wales into 4 regions: North, Mid, Southwest and Southeast, and placing a strong emphasis on regional planning. This is reinforced through the introduction of strategic development plans, which aim to coordinate development across local authority boundaries and reduce fragmentation in decision-making. On what should be built, the scope is deliberately broad. The plan prioritises not only housing, including affordable housing, but also the infrastructure needed to support it, from transport and energy systems to water, waste and digital connectivity. Alongside this, there is a clear focus on economic hubs and regeneration areas, signalling an intent to link housing delivery with wider economic development. But perhaps the most defining aspect of Future Wales is how it frames development itself. Sustainability and climate action sit at the centre of the plan, with planning policy explicitly tied to decarbonisation. This includes strong support for renewable energy, a reduction in car dependency, and a shift towards more sustainable transport systems. More broadly, the plan signals a move towards greater state involvement in shaping development. The public sector is expected to play a more active role, not just in regulating growth, but enabling it through land assembly, infrastructure delivery, and supporting major projects. Housing is recognised as a key pressure point throughout. The plan acknowledges the need to deliver more homes in the right places and suggests that future housing requirements may exceed previous projections. At the same time, it links housing delivery more closely with infrastructure, promoting an infrastructure-led approach to growth, particularly through investment in transport networks, energy projects, and digital systems. Underlying all of this is a strong emphasis on placemaking and well-being, shaped by the Well-Being of Future Generations Act. Focus is not just on the number of homes built, but on the quality of places created, ensuring communities are healthier, better connected, and have access to essential services, while also attempting to protect the environment and the Welsh language. Crucially, Future Wales is not just a vision, it has real weight within the planning system. Local development plans are required to align with it, meaning it directly influences planning decisions, infrastructure investment, and the broader economic geography of Wales. Now, while Future Wales sets out the overarching long-term framework for how Wales develops, it doesn't deal directly with homelessness. That sits within a more targeted set of policies, most notably the Welsh Government's Ending Homelessness Action Plan, which focuses specifically on preventing and addressing homelessness. And in that space, there has been a clear shift in focus during the current Senedd term. Sector bodies such as Cymorth Cymru have pointed to a growing emphasis on homelessness, and that has been reflected in the publication of the Ending Homelessness Action Plan. This increased funding for services and paved the way for the introduction of new legislation. Alongside this, the plan promotes a rapid rehousing model where people are moved into permanent homes as quickly as possible, rather than cycling through temporary accommodation. In this model, temporary housing is no longer seen as the default, but as a short-term and limited intervention. Crucially, the plan recognises that housing supply underpins everything. Without sufficient affordable and particularly social housing, the wider strategy struggles to function. As a result, homelessness is no longer treated as a standalone issue, but as part of a broader system involving health services, social care, criminal justice, and welfare support. This system-wide approach is reinforced through proposed legal and structural reform, building on earlier Welsh legislation and expanding the number of people entitled to support, while embedding a more preventative model across public services. The plan also draws on lessons from the pandemic, raising a central question: if rough sleeping could be significantly reduced during COVID through a no one left out approach, why can that not be sustained? These principles are now being translated into law through the Homelessness and Social Housing Allocation Wales Act, which passed in February 2026. The legislation represents a major overhaul of the system, shifting it from a crisis response to early prevention and fairer access to housing. One of the most significant changes is the extension of the definition of being, quote, threatened with homelessness, end quote, from 56 days to 6 months, giving councils both a duty and the time to intervene earlier. The removal of the priority need test also marks a major shift, reducing gatekeeping and widening access to support. The Act also introduces a new Ask and Act duty, requiring public bodies, including the NHS and social services, to identify those at risk and refer them for help, embedding responsibility across the wider public sector. Alongside this, reforms to social housing allocation aim to create a more consistent system across Wales, while giving local authorities greater control and moving towards a more unified housing register. Taken together, these changes have been described as potentially world-leading, particularly for their focus on prevention and their grounding in lived experience. However, challenges remain. Without a sufficient supply of affordable housing, there is a risk that more people will simply become stuck in temporary accommodation, while the increased responsibilities placed on councils may add further pressure to already stretched systems. Alongside legislative reform, there has also been a significant focus on increasing the supply of social housing. One of the most significant of these commitments is the pledge to deliver 20,000 low-carbon homes during the Senedd term. This was backed by $2 billion through the Social Housing Grant. However, it's important to note that this target was not limited to social rent alone, but spans a mix of affordable housing tenures, including options such as shared ownership. Alongside this, the Transitional Accommodation Capital Programme has focused on improving the quality of temporary housing, moving away from unsuitable options such as bed and breakfast and towards a more dignified, self-contained accommodation. The 20,000 homes target has not yet been met. The Welsh Government has expressed confidence that it will be achieved, albeit later than planned. At the same time, updated estimates suggest that between 7,800 and 9,300 additional homes will be needed annually between 2025 and 2030, highlighting the scale of the ongoing demand. In recognition of this, the Senedd's Local Government and Housing Committee has recommended that social housing should make up at least 20% of Wales's total housing stock, up from around 16% today, underscoring the growing consensus that increasing supply is central to resolving the crisis. While there has been clear progression in recent years, there is also a growing sense across the sector that the ambition behind these reforms is not always fully realised in practice.
And for the most part, they have, improved things. However, they often feel that they get a bit watered down from the initial ambition, and you can see as it goes from white paper to bill to act, how it becomes slightly watered down. But a really good example, you've got it in what been recently introduced in the most recent Homelessness and Social Housing Allocations Bill, Act now, is that it created an ask and act duty on public service bodies, and I think that was even the wording of that was watered down. That was not one of our Taipei's big issues, was about the wording, but I know others. And I think, having watched the evidence sessions, Pete Mackey from Cardiff University said that ask and act was just not rigorous. It didn't put enough responsibility. Whereas it should be something around identify and act. But anyway, this ask and act duty makes different public services to, if they think that someone is at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness, to ask them and to act upon that in terms of a referral to the local authority or whatever it is. Education was not included in this ask and act duty, and I think that and there is obviously, teachers are not social workers, and I think that's a really important thing to remember. But who spends more time with children than teachers? And I think that, or a school environment anyway, it can be the lunch lady as far as I'm concerned. But they are working with they're working with children every day, and they're not they've not been included in these ask act duties. And I think that was a bit of behind the scenes conversations with different people involved in this, and I think there was a real worry about resources.
As Gareth highlights, many of the policies introduced in recent years have had a positive impact, but often feel diluted as they move through the legislative process, from initial proposals through to final implementation. While the direction of travel is widely supported, there is a perception that reforms can become watered down over time, often due to concerns around resources or deliverability. This can result in incremental change, rather than the more ambitious system-wide reform that many in the sector believe is needed. The more and more of these episodes that I'm recording, the more patterns are beginning to emerge. And I will definitely do a conclusion episode where I draw all of that together. But this discussion about incremental reform reminds me of what Jess Blair said in my past episode regarding the electoral reform changes. In that instance, there was a genuine and sincere belief that it was the moment to change the electoral system for good. But instead, a somewhat mid-range reform was brought in, which many experts view as a stopgap, something that will eventually be reformed for the preferential option anyway. And so you have to wonder why it is we just don't try to get things right on the first go. As a result, Wales risks developing an increasingly complex landscape of legislation and guidance without fully addressing the structural issues at the heart of the crisis. The challenge, therefore, is not just to introduce new policies, but to ensure that they are implemented with sufficient ambition to deliver meaningful change. At the same time, there is a notable level of alignment across the third sector, with organisations approaching the issue from different angles, but often arriving at similar conclusions. This growing consensus strengthens the case for reform and adds pressure for ambitious, coordinated action.
If you look at all the different organisations and supporters and people that are involved in the housing sector, you've got social landlords that obviously have got that business model of needing to bring rents in. They're under pressure now from Welsh Government to bring their housing stock up to the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. That's all costing money. And actually, if we're not careful, it can divert money into improving the social housing stock rather than building more social homes just at a time that we need them. We've just produced a report looking at how we could go and buy a load of homes. We've got all these people in temporary accommodation. Why don't we just, it's so difficult to build new houses, why don't we just go and buy a load of them and kind of clear the backlog? And there's a lot of detail in that report that actually looks at even a former council house that was bought by somebody, a social landlord couldn't necessarily go and buy that home now to put it back in the social rented stock because the standards have become so aspirational in terms of energy efficiency. But even things like the size of rooms, whether there are sloping ceilings and all sorts of technical things. So one line we say is actually, well, we've got families in temporary accommodation, which at its worst could be sharing a bed and breakfast room with not enough space even for a cot. At the same time, we've got homes we could be using for social homes, but because we rightly are being aspirational in terms of those standards, there's a conversation across all organisations now at this point, are we being too aspirational? And is it stopping us just getting more properties into the system for the people that need it?
And that raises a difficult question. If we know that there aren't enough homes and we know that people are stuck in temporary accommodation, then what can actually be done to change this? Because while there are ideas and proposals, turning them into action is really that straightforward. And increasingly, attention has turned to how the system itself might need to change, as Debbie Thomas from Crisis explains.
Crisis was quite heavily involved in helping to make recommendations that helped to inform the new law that went through. And what really reassured me was, as part of that process, you know, people with lived experience were really listened to. Like, so many people with lived experience were consulted in the development of that law, and people who have lived through it are the people with the they are the experts. They're the people who know homelessness best. So it's really reassuring that the new legislation has listened to a lot of people's views. That it does make radical change, and when you look at some of the changes in there, they could lead the way in terms of nationally. There's some really bold changes in there. And the other thing that's really positive about it is that parties across the political spectrum have been supportive of it as well. And there's a lot of course, as naturally with any new law coming in, there is some fear of change and what that means before we know how it will be resourced and training and everything. But generally, there's a lot of support across the sector for the change as well. So I think there's a lot of hope that comes from the fact that people want to change, people recognise that we need to change. Um, but it's just about making sure that we have that drive, we have that resource, particularly with a new government coming in and they're going to have lots of different requests from everywhere. But certainly from the housing sector, we're very, very clear that invest in, we've got some good foundations. If we can give it that push, give it that resource, we can really make a difference here. And that is huge, not just to people who are experiencing homelessness, but also to our wider public sector services, knowing that there's so many knock-on effects when homelessness levels get so high as they are at the moment.
So let's move on to solutions. The new legislation is a fitting place to start. As Robin White from Shelter Cymru told me, the first step is making sure the systems we already have are working as they should. The charities largely welcome the new legislation, which passed in February, but they are keen to stress that it is not the end of the road and that now correct and well-funded implementation is what matters. That means ensuring that the new legislation is properly implemented so that people can access support and protection that they are now entitled to.
So fortunately, the legislation has passed, but it's, that's about implementing it. It's about making sure that we listen to people throughout the system, because people are generally the best judge of their unique needs. So hopefully that will mainly be about putting the money and the resourcing in to make the new legislation work in the way it's intended, and perhaps going a bit further in the future. A person-centered approach to homelessness. By that we mean building on the new legislation.
So the causes of the housing crisis are, as we've discussed, fairly complex. But the question now becomes, what can we actually do? Because solving this isn't about one single fix. It's about a combination of long-term planning, investment and reform. And that's reflected in the approach being discussed across the sector, as Ellie explains.
We need that long-term plan. That is our really big call, calling on all political parties to commit to a 10-year plan for housing and 60,000 additional affordable homes over 10 years. It's a recognition that this Senedd can be a turning point for change. We're at a moment where already we've ramped up delivery of social homes, investment in homes, existing homes, and the next decade now offers the opportunity either to be one of managing symptoms, or we can finally confront the problems that we know are there head on and provide the homes and places that people need and deserve. So some of the things that can support delivery that we might want to see is around stable funding environment, with the funding for this financial year as a floor, not a ceiling. We're interested in a national development corporation to support deliveries that might be able to help bring together large-scale strategic sites, remediate sites that may be not viable without that remediation going into them. How government can use its compulsory purchase powers to bring land together and make land available for building homes, and supporting resilient supply chains we'd be looking for addressing challenges in the planning and consenting systems, a huge amount of delays that are faced there, down to a lack of adequate resource and skilled expertise, and the fact that so many local development plans are still not adopted locally, which just makes developments much harder. And we'll be looking for more pragmatism on acquisitions. We talked a bit about the Transitional Accommodation Capital Programme that allows social landlords to bring homes that already exist into the social rented sector. That's actually been a really huge part of the work in the last few years, in increasing the number of additional social homes. We think there's much more scope there, especially looking at those properties that were sold under right to buy. Some might already be in a block or in an area where there's social homes already. There's a lot of logic to bringing those back into social ownership, and that can catalyse delivery really quickly. So be looking for things in those kind of space, but ultimately it's kind of having that view that looks out over the longer term and beyond just single issues, and thinking about how this actually is beneficial to communities in so many different ways, not just in terms of homes, but in terms of social outcomes for people. And alongside that, as I said at the beginning, that it's not just about building new homes. There are also the existing homes need to be invested in, and we have to recognise that the support needs that are there are not currently being met in the way that they need to be. So we need to review what support needs are out there, and how the housing support grant and other funding streams can help to meet those for a multi-year funding settlement that allows people to stay in their homes, prevent people from becoming homeless. That will be absolutely crucial to the homelessness legislation being a success. We need the legislation in place, we need more homes, and we need more support. Those three things together will make that legislation a success.
Then there is a want for more attention to be placed on prevention, ensuring that we do all we can to stop homelessness in the first instance. To better understand how homelessness can be prevented, policymakers and researchers often draw on the 5-level prevention typology developed by Professor Suzanne Fitzpatrick and Professor Peter McKay. Rather than focusing solely on crisis response, the framework sets out how prevention can and should operate at every stage. At the broadest level is universal prevention, which aims to reduce the overall risk of homelessness across the population. This includes addressing the structural drivers of homelessness, such as poverty, lack of affordable housing, and weakness in employment and welfare systems. The next level is targeted prevention, which focuses on early intervention for those most at risk. This includes groups such as people leaving prison, young people exiting care, or those in unstable housing situations where timely support can prevent homelessness from occurring. Crisis prevention sits closer to the point of homelessness itself, involving short-term interventions for individuals who are at imminent risk of losing their home. The aim here is to stabilise the situation before it escalates. Emergency prevention applies in cases where someone is left at immediate, often that day, risk of homelessness or rooflessness. While urgent accommodation may be required, the focus remains on preventing a long-term experience of homelessness. Finally, repeat prevention focuses on ensuring that people who have previously experienced homelessness do not find themselves drawn back into it. This involves sustained support to address the underlying causes and the creation of long-term stability. Taken together, the typology presents prevention not as a single intervention, but as a layered approach, one that recognises homelessness can be avoided at multiple points if the right systems are in place. This layered approach also reinforces a broader shift in thinking. As Cymorth Cymru highlights in their manifesto, homelessness cannot be treated as a housing issue alone, but it must be understood as a public service responsibility. Preventing homelessness requires coordinated action across the government, with all public services playing a role in identifying risk early and of intervening before a crisis occurs. From this perspective, prevention extends beyond housing departments to include health services, social care, criminal justice and welfare systems, each of which has a role to play in both universal and targeted prevention, whether through reducing poverty, supporting vulnerable groups, or identifying those at risk earlier. Responsibility for prevention sits across that entire system. Cummoth argues that this approach must be embedded at the highest level of government, with homelessness made a cross-government priority and reflected in the annual budget. Without this, efforts to prevent homelessness risk remaining fragmented, rather than forming part of a coherent preventative system. However, even with a strongly preventative system, homelessness cannot always be avoided. In these cases, the focus shifts from prevention to the minimisation of harm, ensuring that experiences of homelessness remain as brief as possible. This is where rapid rehousing becomes central. As Cummoth Cymru notes, a rapid rehousing approach aims to minimise the time that people spend in temporary accommodation, moving them into settled homes with the right support as quickly as possible. Wales has made positive progress in adopting this model in recent years, but continued delivery will depend on local authorities and their partners having the resources and capacity to sustain that. Closely aligned with this is the Housing First approach, which represents a further shift in how homelessness is addressed. Rather than requiring individuals to resolve complex issues before accessing stable housing, Housing First prioritises providing a permanent home immediately, followed then by intensive person-centred support. In practice, this means securing housing first and then supporting individuals to stabilise other areas of their lives, whether related to health, addiction, or wider social needs. The model has been particularly effective for those with complex and long-term experiences of homelessness, for whom traditional pathways have tended to fail. In Wales, Housing First has demonstrated strong outcomes, with tenancy sustainment rates of around 91% since 2018. This reflects the effectiveness of a model that prioritises stability, dignity, and long-term support, rather than conditional or sequential approaches. Taken together, rapid rehousing and Housing First reinforce a broader shift in the system, from managing homelessness through temporary solutions to resolving it more quickly and sustainably. Alongside policy reform and system redesign, the role of funding for support services remains critical to the success of homeless prevention in Wales. The majority of homelessness prevention and housing support services are funded through the Housing Support Grant and the Homelessness Prevention Grant. Together, these fund a wide range of essential services, including housing advice, tenancy support, supported accommodation, domestic abuse refuges, and Housing First programmes. These are the services that operate on the front line, working directly with individuals to prevent homelessness or support them out of it. The Housing Support Grant in particular is central to this system. It is Wales's main revenue fund for homelessness prevention and housing support services, delivered through local authorities. Crucially, it funds support rather than buildings, unlike the Social Housing Grant, which is used for developing new homes. This distinction matters, as prevention depends not only on housing supply, but on the services that help people sustain tenancy and avoid crisis. While funding has recently increased from around 200 million to 220 million per year, there is growing concern that this has not kept pace with rising demands and inflation. As Cummoth Cymru highlights, in real terms, current funding levels are no higher than they were in 2012. Those pressures on the sector are becoming increasingly visible. Recent surveys show that 66% of homelessness and housing support providers are running commission services at a deficit, with 60% relying on reserves to make up for insufficient local authority funding. At the same time, demand is rising sharply. 86% of providers reported an increase in demand, while 97% have seen a rise in the complexity of people's individual needs. This creates a fundamental tension at the heart of the system. While policy increasingly emphasises prevention, the services responsible for delivering that are operating under significant financial strain. Sustainable reform, therefore, requires not only investment in housing supply, but long-term adequate funding for support services. This includes ensuring sufficient staffing levels, fair pay, and the capacity to meet increasingly complex needs. Without this, even the most well-designed preventative systems risk falling short in practice. While prevention and system reforms are essential, they ultimately depend on one fundamental condition: the availability of the right kind of housing. Because without enough homes, and particularly without enough homes that are genuinely affordable, even the most effective preventative strategies will struggle to succeed. You can improve legislation, strengthen support services, and vow to intervene earlier. But if there is nowhere for people to go, the system can only do so much. And that brings the focus back to one of the most critical pressures within the Welsh housing system: social housing, and more specifically, homes for social rent. Across the sector, there is broad agreement that increasing the supply of social housing is central to any long-term solution. But building more homes is not a quick fix. It requires land, planning capacity, construction, and crucially, sustained investment. Because as with many aspects of the housing crisis, funding sits at the heart of it. And without long-term reliable investment, it becomes significantly harder to deliver the scale of housing that is needed.
Ultimately, to build a significant amount of social housing, you need grant funding from the Welsh Government. But we know that the way the Welsh Government's budget works, it is not necessarily in their gift to give without taking from somewhere else. So what we are then talking about is where in that budget can we move money around. That's unfortunate, and I don't think that should be the situation we are in. In an ideal world, you would either get more support from the UK government or you would be given borrowing powers to deliver social homes. That would make so much sense because building social homes is an investment, not just in people, but it's an investment in Wales. It delivers a return because you've got people in employment building the homes themselves. It delivers a return because good quality housing reduces the pressure on the NHS. It's a really sensible investment. And because people pay rent, it also pays itself back over time. So it is properly something you should be able to borrow to do. But that's not the situation we're in. I imagine the Welsh Government will keep lobbying the UK government to get themselves there. In the meantime, we are going to have to keep asking the Welsh Government to put greater percentages of its budget towards delivering homes as a recognition of this is investing in the long term to save money. You know, we will see that pay off. But I don't pretend that this is an easy decision for the First Minister, for cabinet secretaries across the board. They're working with a system that isn't ideal. I also think RSLs and local authorities are also doing their bit. They are borrowing money to try and build homes. The reality is right now simply that the ability to raise funds is smaller than the demand.
But funding is only part of that picture. Because while housing is devolved in Wales, many of the levers that shape how the system actually functions sit in Westminster. And that creates tension where responsibility is shared, but control is not always aligned, as Debbie Thomas from Crisis explains.
It's been really good to see this support at Senedd. And there's obviously housing is a devolved issue. There's lots and lots that the Welsh Government can do to make a huge difference in this space. But I do think it's also important to continue to put the pressure on Westminster and UK government as well, because there are quite a few levers that are held across the seven that are really important actually in terms of ending homelessness, preventing homelessness. So, for example, housing benefit. At the moment, our private rented sector is really, really difficult. You know, we've got people who are waiting for a social home. There's waiting lists of 94,000. So people are struggling to get access to social homes. They're turning to the private rented sector, but it's not really affordable. So housing benefit rates have been not been keeping up with how rents are in reality, not for a long time. And actually in Wales, the picture is probably more bleak than anywhere else in Great Britain. So our research with the property website Zoopla shows that only 1% of homes that are advertised for private rent across Wales are actually affordable to people who are relying on housing benefit. So it can be nigh on impossible to find a private rented property that people can afford. And you know, if you add to that the fact that you often need money up front for deposits, you need rent guarantors. You know, some people that we work with, they fled abuse. They don't necessarily have family networks to call on to act as guarantors. So there's lots of difficulties in terms of accessing private rental properties, and the levers there are absolutely within the control of Westminster in terms of reviewing how housing benefit works, and benefits more broadly as well, because our benefit system, in terms of supporting people who are in financial difficulty, it's just not, the sums aren't adding up. It's not doing the job that it was intended to do. So there is a lot of hope. There's a lot of change on the horizon with the Senedd, which I really hope will continue when we have a very different makeup in the Parliament. And I know certainly everyone across the housing sector will be pushing for them to take this issue seriously. But I think we also need to push at a Westminster level for the levers that they hold that can make a big difference across Great Britain, including Wales.
Within those constraints, the question then becomes not just how much is built, but what is prioritised.
Particularly when we talk about building houses, we need more of pretty much every kind of home. Our big focus is homes for social rent. That is because for the people we see through our advice surgeries, social rent is almost always the best option for them, not just because social rent homes tend to be cheaper than homes, say, in the private rented sector, but also because it's a fundamentally different product. It's more secure. It has a different type of landlord. That is where we would like to see significantly more focus, but also where we are really, really far behind. So our research suggests that there are at least 170,000 people in Wales who are already waiting for a social home. That's the existing backlog, and then the problem is growing year on year because we are struggling to catch up. Credit to the Welsh Government. They've tried really hard over the last Senedd period. We've definitely seen progress. But, our job is to say, well done on the progress, but we've got a long way to go. Often you'll hear people talk about council housing. We have a very long tradition of council housing in the UK, particularly in Wales, because of the connection to the beginning of social housing. Council housing is often used as the word when what we actually mean is social rent. So a social rent home is going to be a home owned by a landlord that might be a housing association or a council. It's going to be let out at a rent that is connected to local incomes, in theory. Those rents tend to be much lower. The type of contract you'll have with that landlord will also be quite different from the private rented sector, in that those contracts will last. They're not short-term contracts, they're lifetime contracts. People spend a lot of, people get a social home, they will often feel like that is their home, in a way that you don't get with the private rented sector. We are very keen to say social rent specifically, because what we have right now is a system where there are a multitude of different types of affordable home, some of which are to rent, some of which are to buy. Social rent is a specific product within that, but we find it's important to say that's the one we mean, not other forms of affordable homes, which aren't, not saying they're bad, but the one we need most is the social rent product. And again, credit to the Welsh Government, the vast majority of affordable housing delivered in Wales is for social rent. That's not the same in England. In England, it is a minority of what is delivered.
Alongside the need to increase supply, there is also a growing conversation about how social housing is perceived. Too often, social housing is framed as a last resort, something people fall back on, rather than something to aspire to. But this framing overlooks the role it can play as stable, secure and good quality housing that supports people to build their lives. In reality, social housing offers a fundamentally different product to much of the private rented sector. It provides a longer-term security, more stable rent levels, and a closer relationship between landlord and tenant. For many, this stability is not just beneficial, it is transformative. Reframing social housing as something aspirational is therefore not just about changing its purpose, but about recognising its value. It's not a simple safety net, but a core part of a functioning housing system, one that should be available to more people, not fewer. This shift in perception also matters for delivery. If social housing continues to be seen as a residual or secondary, it risks being deprioritised. But if it is understood as essential infrastructure, on par with, say, health or education, it strengthens the case for investment, expansion, and long-term planning.
In the past, I've kind of talked about the housing ladder, and you'd talk about a social home perhaps being at the bottom of that ladder. I would say actually it is aspirational, because actually you'd say that the key to a social home is that golden ticket to stability and knowing where you are within your community now, rather than perhaps every 12 months feeling that you've got to go and look for another private rented home. It's also the place where, because rents are regulated, that you stand half a chance of thinking about saving a deposit towards becoming an owner-occupier. We're called the Bevan Foundation after an area in Bevan. When he first talked about social housing, it was meant to be all about homes for all, that the butcher lived next door to the bank manager, and we haven't got that supply anymore. It's a big word, but we talk about residualisation of the housing stock, that we sold some of the best prime properties, and also we ended up with people perhaps on the lowest income sat there. Social housing has changed a lot from what it was originally intended to be. From the work that we're focusing on is primarily around boosting the supply of social homes. So whereas previously we've done work around improving the affordability of the private rented sector and looking at the level of housing benefit you can get versus what rents are currently going up to, we felt that actually if we look at where our supply of social homes is, compared to where it was perhaps in the 1980s before the right to buy came along, we lost 150,000 homes to the right to buy policy, which ended in Wales in 2019. We've only replaced half of those homes. So as actually, when that policy came into place, about 30% of the homes in our communities were social homes. And I think of social homes as kind of the safety net. It's the place where we should have enough housing for people on the lowest incomes to, in that kind of regulated space, in terms of the relationship between social landlords and Welsh Government and rent levels and security. Now we've only got about 18%, 16 to 80% of social homes in our community. So there isn't that safety net to fall back on in terms of social housing provision. What we've also said, and it kind of relates to your conversations with Crisis, is really we think that only a social home provides the security and certainty to rebuild your life after the trauma of homelessness. If you've been through the homelessness system, your duty to be accommodated can be ended by a private rented property or a social home. However, we know that because there isn't that ban on no fault evictions, because rents aren't regulated, actually, can you kind of get that grounding? Can you feel that that home is kind of where you're going to rebuild your life? Whereas if you are able to get a social home, you know that you're there for as long as you want to be. There's regulation and there's controls in place and there's the support of a social landlord. So it feels like a really important thing to be boosting that supply to kind of start filling some of those affordability gaps.
Again, like we echoed earlier, while there is broad agreement that more homes need to be built, the reality is that delivery continues to fall significantly short of demand. There are a number of barriers that sit behind this shortfall, many of which are structural and have built up over time. One of the most frequently cited is, of course, planning systems. According to the Home Builders Federation, delays in planning decisions continue to slow development, with lengthy timelines, repeated design changes, and protracted negotiations, particularly around affordable housing requirements. This then creates uncertainty and tends to hold up delivery. In response, there have been calls for stricter time limits on decisions and a reduction in any avoidable delays. Closely linked to this is the role of local development plans, or LDPs, which are intended to guide where and how developments take place across Wales. While every local authority is expected to have an up-to-date plan, many are now outdated, often based on older population projections and no longer aligned with current policy priorities such as net zero targets or updated assessments of need. This creates a disconnect between policy ambition and what is actually deliverable on the ground. More broadly, developers point to a wider issue of complexity and bureaucracy within the system. This includes what is often described as policy burden, a combination of environmental regulations, planning obligations, and regulatory costs, which, while individually justified, can cumulatively slow or constrain development. This is a particularly contentious area, reflecting the tension between the need to accelerate housing delivery and the need to maintain environmental and planning standards. There are also more practical constraints within the building industry itself. Skill shortages continue to limit capacity, while rising costs, particularly for materials and energy, have made development more expensive and in some cases less viable. Smaller and medium-sized builders have been particularly affected, reducing diversity within the market and further limiting the supply. In addition, questions remain around land availability and infrastructure. Unlocking suitable land for development, alongside ensuring that transport, energy, and other infrastructures are in place, remains a challenge. Without this, even approved developments may struggle to progress at pace. Finally, there is a lack of clear system-wide targets for housing delivery. While Wales has set an explicit target for affordable homes, 20,000 homes over the current Senedd term, there is no equivalent benchmark for private sector delivery, despite it being central to that supply. Proposals such as extending Help to Buy Wales, including raising the current 300,000 price cap, reflect attempts to stimulate this part of the market, but also underline the extent to which private delivery remains a necessary, if complex, part of the solution. The decline in social housing has reduced the system's ability to provide a stable, affordable safety net, particularly for those on the lowest incomes or recovering from homelessness. There's an economic argument for building more houses too. Building more homes doesn't just address housing need, it also stimulates economic growth by creating jobs, boosting local supply chains, and increasing long-term productivity. Additionally, there are also moves to try and persuade private landlords to join the social housing sector, but at the moment, take-up hasn't been massive.
Anecdotally, private landlords leaving the private rented sector and looking to move properties into the social rented sector, looking to housing associations to help, which is something that has happened increasingly over the last few years. There's been a fund called the Transitional Accommodation Programme, which has enabled housing associations and local authorities to buy properties from other sectors and bring them into the social rented sector, sometimes saving tenancies, but ultimately bringing in properties into a sector that's more highly regulated, has higher standards overall, and where rents are regulated, of course, as well.
Yeah, so there's been a scheme that was introduced a few years ago. It's called Leasing Scheme Wales. And it's about offering a chance to private landlords to rent their homes through social rent. So, but to get some perks with that. So basically, they are then eligible for grants to bring their housing up to standard. They're guaranteed social rent for a certain number of years. Local councils take over the management of that property. So there's lots of perks to it. But it is still developing, I would say. And we need, to boost programs like that, to get more properties coming through, to raise awareness of it, and to see what we can do to incentivize more landlords to take that scheme up. Because, when we've got such a big housing crisis on our hands, of course, we need to have a really strong focus on building and building more social homes. But we also need to take a wide lens view and take every single opportunity that we can to get that housing boosted to meet needs.
Reforming the private housing market is also seen as a critical part of addressing homelessness in Wales. As social housing supply has declined and demand has increased, more people have been pushed into that rental market, where costs are higher and security is often lower. This has made the private sector a key pressure point within the housing system, particularly for those at risk of homelessness. From this perspective, reform must go beyond supply alone and focus on prevention. This means creating a private rental market that is more stable, affordable, and responsive to risk. Measures such as improving tenant protections, stabilising rent, and strengthening regulation are not simply market interventions. They are also preventative tools that can reduce the likelihood of people falling into homelessness. As Cymorth Cymru highlights, this requires a cross-government approach, with responsibility extending beyond that housing policy alone. For that reason, reforms to the private rental sector are something that many of the organisations are also asking for. Here's Robin from Shelter.
We are clear. We think the private rented sector in Wales is broken. It is increasingly unaffordable. In fact, Wales has had the fastest rising rents in Britain for well over a year now. It's not secure. People can be evicted really quite easily. It simply doesn't work for what we need. And it's also gone through an unbelievable growth over the last 20 years. So we think real reform is needed in the private rented sector to protect people from eviction, to look at controlling rents.
And it's concerns like these that are beginning to push the conversation beyond reform alone. Because if a growing part of the housing system is no longer providing affordability or security, it raises more fundamental questions. What should housing actually guarantee? Beyond questions of supply, funding and delivery, there is a growing conversation about whether housing should be treated not just as a policy, but as a legal right, a human right.
The right to an adequate home is something that's recognised in international law, but it's not been adopted by any nation in the UK. And we could put that into law in Wales. It would help us with that necessity of long-term planning, for example, because you don't solve a housing emergency in 4-year Senedd terms. You couldn't solve it in 5-year Senedd terms. You're definitely not going to solve it in 4-year terms. It's got to be over multiple years. It's got to be about progressively doing a little bit better every year. And we think, that is a legal right that makes a lot of sense. And we've been calling for it alongside partners in the sector for a number of years.
The idea of housing as a human right is not in itself new. It has been recognised internationally for decades, most notably in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which define housing as part of the right to an adequate standard of living. However, the way this right is understood goes far beyond simply having a roof over one's head. Housing, in this context, is defined as the right to live somewhere in security, peace and dignity, meaning it must be safe, stable, affordable and suitable for that person's needs. This reflects a broader understanding of housing's role in society. Housing is not an isolated issue, it is central to well-being. The absence of adequate housing has clear and far-reaching consequences, affecting physical and mental health, educational attainment, and long-term life outcomes. In this way, the argument for housing as a right is closely tied to its wider impact. Housing and health in particular are deeply interconnected. Poor housing can contribute to illness, stress and instability, while secure and appropriate housing can support recovery, stability and opportunity. Addressing one without the other limits what either can achieve. Recognising housing as a right, therefore, implies a shift in how it is governed. Recognising housing as a right, therefore, implies a shift in how it's governed. It moves housing beyond a single policy and into a cross-government responsibility, one that requires coordination across health, social care, welfare and wider public services. The scale of its impact demands a system that reflects that complexity. However, while the right to adequate housing is recognised internationally, it is not currently fully enforceable in domestic law across the UK. This creates a gap between what is agreed in principle and what is delivered in practice. As a result, the debate is not only about whether housing is a right, but about how that right is realised. Translating that principle into reality requires more than legislation alone. It requires accountability, awareness, and the ability for individuals to understand and enforce their rights when those rights are not met. Ultimately, the case for housing as a right is not abstract. It's rooted in the recognition that housing shapes almost every aspect of people's lives, and that without it, many other rights and opportunities remain out of reach. Maslow's hierarchy of needs shows that before people can focus on relationships, confidence, or personal growth, they must first have their most basic needs met, including safe, stable housing.
As Taupav, our big ask is to implement the right to adequate housing, which would create would put housing, legislate housing as a human right, and it would commit the next Welsh government, but all other Welsh governments that come after, to work towards the progressive realisation of housing, because we know that that's not something that's going to be changed overnight. Right to adequate housing encompasses everything around. You can use different housing, rehousing methods such as rapid rehousing or housing first. You can look at stuff around house building, etc., but it creates that framework, and it's not something that is completely new, because there's plenty of international examples of where it's worked and where it's not worked and different ways of achieving it. But also in Wales, we've already got existing frameworks that act in similar ways. We've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, in Wales, which creates that framework in terms of every policy decision, every legislative action has to consider that the well-being of future generations. So why not have a similar thing for housing, which commits to creating that right to adequate housing? This
is something that Will Hayward also acknowledges and states in his chapter about housing in his new book, Who Cares About Wales, stating, quote, "A home is perhaps the most fundamental of human needs. It is the foundation on which everything else is built. Having a home doesn't mean that you're going to be in great health, get a good education, or find a well-paid job. But if you don't have a home, you can sure as hell bet that you won't have any of those other things." End quote. And underpinning all of this is a wider shift in how housing is understood, not just as a cost, but as an investment. Because while building homes, funding services and reforming systems all requires upfront spending, the evidence increasingly shows that the long-term returns can be significant. Research cited by Cymorth Cymru, conducted by Cardiff Metropolitan University, found that for every £1 invested in homelessness and housing services, £1.40 is saved across public services in Wales. Based on the current £250 million housing support grant, that equates to around £495 million in total savings, including £229 million to the health service, £199 million to social care, and £79 million to the criminal justice system. In other words, the cost of not investing in housing doesn't disappear, it simply shows up elsewhere, in hospitals, social services, and the justice system. So the question is no longer just whether we can afford to invest in housing, but the correct question is whether we can afford not to. Across the housing sector, there is a striking level of agreement about what needs to happen next. Different organisations may focus on different parts of the system, but the overall direction is broadly aligned, as Debbie Thomas from Crisis explains.
In the next Senedd term, I genuinely feel like there's a lot of synergy across all of our housing organisations in terms of what we're calling for. And certainly what Crisis is calling for, and what I know a lot of other people are calling for, is for a renewed strategy to end homelessness, so that everyone is on the same page, so that we have this core focus on bringing those awful numbers down, in making sure people are prevented from ever having to live through homelessness. So having that strategy is really key. And as part of that, making sure we implement the homelessness bill. You know, people have worked so hard to get key changes to our legislation, which could make a massive difference, but it's going to need proper investment, effective implementation if it's going to really make that difference. And then the third thing is building more social homes, which I'm sure everyone will say it's kind of the obvious point, but it is a very important point. We must have that investment and that focus on creating affordable places that people can call home.
But delivering those homes and delivering that strategy depends on something else, coordination. Because one of the challenges repeatedly raised by organisations is not just a lack of action, but a lack of alignment within the governmental system, as Ellie explains.
It has to be that cross-government piece that makes sure that all the different parts of the government system are pulling in the right direction. Really clear with the marine nitrates issue, where it's happened twice now. Marine nitrates, and then before that we had phosphates, where one part of government, the Natural Resources Wales, has put up guidance that has completely stopped development of affordable homes. Despite that kind of, no one really wanting that to be the case, and housing not being the main contributor to those issues, but there's just that lack of join up to kind of like, well, what's government's overall aim? How are we going to get there together as all the different parts of the public and third sector? And so there's a definite consensus across housing organisations that is necessary.
All of this means that while solutions may be broadly agreed upon, delivering them requires different parts of the system: government, local authorities, regulators, housing associations, and they all need to be moving in the same direction. So if there is growing consensus across the sector about what needs to happen, the next question is whether that is reflected in the political choices being made. At the time of recording this episode, only 2 parties have published their full manifestos for the next election: the Conservatives and reform. Plaid Cymru have also set out its priorities through its first 100 days plan, but not yet the manifesto. I'll be returning to this in a future episode once all manifestos have been released, and we will revisit what the other parties are offering. But based on what we have so far, there are some clear differences in approach. Welsh Labour has not yet published a full manifesto at the time of recording, but it is worth noting that homelessness was explicitly referenced within their priorities during their campaign launch, particularly under their Fairer Wales agenda. They signalled a continued commitment to tackling homelessness in the next Senedd term. From what we know of Plaid Cymru's proposals, it currently focuses on increasing the role of state in delivering housing. One of their key commitments is the creation of a new national development body, UNOS, designed to work alongside local authorities and housing associations to assemble land, secure finance, and accelerate the delivery of social housing. In theory, this could address some of the structural barriers around land and coordination, but as with many proposals, its impact would depend heavily on how it is implemented in practice. Plaid have also committed to exploring a right to adequate housing, signalling a shift towards treating housing as a legal entitlement rather than a purely policy objective. They've also proposed making rent fairer. Reform UK places a strong emphasis on increasing housing supply in their manifesto, particularly through changes to planning and delivery. They argue that Wales faces a significant housing shortfall and proposes speeding up planning decisions, intervening where councils fail to deliver, and strengthening the presumption in favour of development in high-demand areas. Their approach also includes replacing the Help to Buy scheme with targeted incentives and addressing infrastructure funding gaps where local authorities have not implemented tools such as the Community Infrastructure Levy. However, their proposals also include a more controversial element, such as introducing a 10-year residency requirement for access to social housing, prioritising certain groups while placing restrictions on eligibility for others. Their focus is on increasing supply, with less emphasis on affordability, security, or regulation within the private rented sector. The Welsh Conservatives similarly focus on increasing housing supply, but with a stronger emphasis on home ownership. Their vision is for what they describe as a home-owning democracy, with policies designed to make it easier for people to buy, including expanding Help to Buy, removing land transaction tax for primary residences, and offering financial incentives for first-time buyers. They also controversially propose restoring the right to buy policy, the allowing of social housing tenants to purchase their homes, with the intention of reinvesting proceeds into new housing. However, critics argue this policy was a key factor for the reduction of stock in the first place. However, Conservatives do say they will reinvest that money into new housing, counterbalancing it in their opinion. Alongside this, the Conservative Party pledged to building 40,000 new homes by 2030, reforming planning processes and introducing measures to address homelessness, including ending the use of hotels for families and improving coordination between local authorities. Their approach combines supply-side reforms with targeted system improvements, but again raises questions about the balance between home ownership and that need for social housing. What is clear is that while there is agreement over the scale of the problem, there is less agreement on what would solve it. And with housing likely to be a defining issue in the next Senedd term, the choices made now will shape not just how many homes are built, but who those homes are for and whether the system is able to meet the needs of the people it is meant to serve. What emerges from all of this is not just a housing crisis, but a system that has become increasingly expensive precisely because it is no longer functioning as intended. At every stage, the failure to regulate effectively and to replace what has been lost has created a chain reaction of costs. The sell-off of social housing without adequate replacement of reduced supply. Borrowing restrictions limited councils' ability to build. The removal of rent controls shifted power to the market. And in the absence of sufficient genuinely affordable homes, more people have been pushed into that private rented sector, where costs are higher, conditions are often poorer, and security is far less certain. The financial consequences of these shifts are now deeply embedded in the system. Housing benefit, once designed as a safety net, has increasingly become a mechanism for sustaining high rents, with significant amounts of public money flowing into that sector by its very nature, more expensive than what it once replaced. And yet, even that support no longer reflects the reality of the market, leaving tenants to absorb much of the shortfall themselves. At the sharpest end, this failure becomes even more costly. As affordability breaks down and tenancies collapse, more households are pushed into temporary accommodation, one of the most expensive and least effective parts of the entire system. Local authorities are left paying high nightly rates simply to manage a crisis, rather than investing in long-term solutions that would reduce both human and financial cost over time. And this is the central contradiction. It is costing more because it is failing. What could have been a model built on stability, affordability, and long-term investment has instead become reactive, fragmented, and financially inefficient. Public money is spent managing the consequences, rising rents, housing insecurity, homelessness, rather than addressing the root causes, a lack of genuinely affordable homes. Ultimately, the housing crisis is not just about supply or demand in isolation. It is about the cumulative impact of policy decisions made over decades that have prioritised short-term flexibility over long-term resilience. And until that balance is addressed, the cost, both human and financial, will continue to rise. But throughout this episode, there's also been something else, something quieter but as important: consensus. Across charities, housing organisations and experts, there is a shared understanding of the problem and the direction of travel, the need for more social housing, the importance of prevention, the role of better regulation, the value of long-term investment, the need for a system that works not just in the moments of crisis, but as a stable foundation for people's lives. That alignment matters because it shows that it is not an unsolvable problem. The solution already exists. The evidence is there. And in many cases, the foundations in legislation, in strategy, in experience are in place. The question now is whether political will matches the scale of that challenge. Because housing is not just another policy area, it is the foundation on which we build everything: health, education, work, family life, and opportunity. And getting it right doesn't just change where people live, it changes how people live. Before we finish, I want to reiterate what I said in the introduction and to say a sincere thank you to everyone who contributed to this episode, to the charities, organisations and individuals who gave me their time, shared their expertise, and in many cases spoke about those difficult realities. Your insights have shaped this conversation and made it possible to understand not just the system, but the human impact it's having. Because behind every single statistic is a person, a family, a life that could look very different with the right support. And while the scale of the challenge is clear, so too is the opportunity. And behind all of that, there is hope. Not because the situation is easy, but because the path forward is visible. And in the years ahead, the choices made will determine whether Wales continues to manage the consequences of the crisis or finally reaches the point of resolving it. You have been listening to Wales in Context. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast and share it with someone interested in the future of Wales. All notes and resources from today's episode can be found in the show notes. You could also follow Wales in Context on TikTok, and if you'd like to support the podcast, please consider leaving a comment or a review. Thank you for listening. Diolch.